What? Oh, the mic. How do I read and hold the mic?
Um, Good question.
This will be interesting.
Well, if you project,
I don't think I need the mic.
Okay.
If this catches it for catching, that's fine. I'll be loud enough for
Okay.
them. I don't even think we need the mic for that.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming. This is Writers and Books Visiting Authors Series. My name's Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs here. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit literary center dedicated to promoting reading and writing as lifelong activities for people of all ages and backgrounds. So I want to thank you for coming. Thank you to everyone online. We're so pleased to have Lester Friedman with us today for the launch of his second edition of Citizen Spielberg. He'll read a selection, then he'll be in conversation with Jared Case, we're so happy to have as well. There'll also be time for Q&A. I want to say books are for sale downstairs for 15% off. Steven Spielberg's extraordinary career redefined Hollywood, but his achievement goes far beyond shattered box office records. Rejecting the view of Spielberg as a Barnum-esque purveyor of spectacle, Lester Friedman presents the filmmaker as a major artist who pairs ongoing willingness to challenge himself with widely recognized technical mastery. His examination reveals a sustained artistic vision that shows no sign of exhausting itself or audiences after nearly 50 years. Jared Case has spent 20 years at the George Eastman Museum as a film archivist. He's now the curator of film exhibitions at the Dryden Theater, curating film programs as well as gallery exhibitions. Lester D. Friedman is an emeritus professor and former chair of the Media and Society program at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. He is the author of Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde and co-author of Monstrous Progeny, A History of the Frankenstein Narratives. And he also has mentioned that he is a Jeopardy champion. So I'll now turn it over to Les. Thanks for being here.
You want me to start reading? Want me to start by reading?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for coming. Most of you had heard me yammer on at great length anyhow, so it's nice to have you here. You can all hear me in the back. Once you can hear me, so I won't use the mic. So I'm going to read not long for a couple of sections of the first introduction and the second introduction. And the first introduction is called The Elephant in the Room, and to the first edition. I didn't begin to write about Steven Spielberg as a labor of love. It began when my students at Syracuse University requested a course on Spielberg, and much to my surprise, I could not find a comprehensive book that provided what I would call a scholarly study of his films. Most were concerned with other matters. They talked about his career, they talked about biographies, interviews, behind-the-scene revelations, but I couldn't understand why scholars had ignored Spielberg, who is, after all, arguably the most important film screen director over the last 3 decades. Then my friend Frank Manchel answered me. He said, "You know, Les, film is a medium where the more successful you are commercially, the less acceptable you are to the critical community." And he added, "Until you die, at least." So Spielberg's cinema is filled with too many earthly delights. It's too stuffed with things that go bump in the night, too reliant on emotional manipulation to command favorable academic attention. As a result, Spielberg has been characterized as nothing more than a P.T. Barnum, a technically gifted, intellectually shallow showman who substitutes spectacle for substance and emotion for depth. I could say, the thing I would add quickly is that when I went to write this book and I told my colleagues about it, I got a variety of comments. 2 of my favorites were my friend David Desser says, "You know, Les, this is like doing academic pornography. You can never be legitimate again." Yes, and my friend Murray said simply, "You know, Spielberg's the Antichrist." You know, I mean, that's sort of how it was when I started. Steven Spielberg then embodies both the excessives and the ideology of mainstream American filmmaking. He has, in fact, become a synonym for Hollywood itself, an incarnation of Hollywood's large-scale, world-conquering ambitions. Within the book, I try to engage with all of these arguments, but the point is this. No other film artist in history has matched Spielberg's uncanny ability to tap into the public collective imagination while simultaneously displaying a business acumen usually reserved for CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Spielberg is unarguably the most influential filmmaker since the 60s. In fact, Spielberg has become a brand name, and his films often interact not only with American cinema, but with larger ideas in American culture. So I'm going to turn quickly to the new chapter, new preface. And I start by saying, it's a long chat, and then I start by saying, all this now seems an appropriate time to reveal a little of my personal history. As a film scholar, I see my role as exploring cinema, not pitting filmmakers against each other. Two directors enter the cage and one survives. Well, that's a slogan for the Thunderdome, not for the Academy. Yet, colleagues, students, again and again and again, have asked me to rank Spielberg's best and worst films. And I find this difficult. Like all of you sitting here, I changed. I fell in love. I helped to raise children. I got married. I changed jobs. I grew older. And along with that, my taste changed, so that something I found maybe 10 years ago, now I found simple-minded or not particularly interested. But with the arrival of Spielberg's 10 new films, and imagine this guy is my age, 76, and he's making movies. He'll have one out in the spring again. I'm just assuming he lives on 5 Hour. You know, he can't, the energy is unbelievable at that particular age. But with the arrival of these 10 movies, I would like to contextualize their productions within the overflow of Spielberg's now streaming output. So I'm going to tell you my 10 favorite Spielberg films. And remember, I said favorite, not the best, not the most financially successful, not the most popular, but the movies I respond to in descending order. And on the top of the list, I put Schindler's List. And I follow that by Jaws. Now, that's the Spielberg moment. Prestige moment, popcorn movie. And he's done it his whole career. So, the list. Schindler's List, Jaws, Empire of the Sun, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Minority Report, Munich, a very underrated film, Lincoln, AI, and Saving Private Ryan would be my top 10, with maybe West Side Story making its way into that list after all. So let me quickly add that all of Spielberg's films provide ample evidence of his continuing technical and storytelling expertise. And I'm sure, even though this will elicit howls from Spielberg detractors, that even Spielberg's middle-range films, not great movies, have segments, and sometimes more than segments, that outshine the best work of other directors now in the cinema. And I'll conclude quickly with a couple of thoughts. Looking back on the gallery of saints and sinners who comprise the last great era of filmmaking, I'm sure you don't agree, the Raging Bulls and Easy Riders of the 70s, we find only two survivors still functioning at the height of their powers. That would be Martin Scorsese and Spielberg. Others from that generation still plow the field, but their labors evoke little excitement and anticipation. While Spielberg's films always contain his trademark fixations, they also demonstrate his skill as a narrative filmmaker. They are increasingly concerned with moral issues rather than roller coaster narratives or adolescent fantasies. No doubt surprising to his detractors, Steven Spielberg has evolved into a director of thought and spirit, as well as one of spectacle and style. He has demonstrated a sustained intellectual growth and maturity that 4 decades ago seemed impossible to imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Les. Unfortunately, you and I seem to think along the same lines. I think you've stolen a lot of my questions, so there may be some repetition in here. And academically, we're thinking about, well, why are we here? What's the main focus? So I have a clutch of questions that are interrelated that you've gone over a little bit. Why Spielberg? Why twice? And why now?
You mean why Spielberg? You can hear, right? Yeah, yeah. Why Spielberg for me? Or why Spielberg?
Yeah. For you, and you've already mentioned that there was the lack. You write the thing that you want to see.
Yeah, and as I say, that started it. How is it possible we have 10 books on Hungarian filmmakers and none on Spielberg? No, which is true. Any academic will tell you that story. So I was attracted to it because I sort of lit up and thought, ooh, no one's done this. I can do this. And so I went into it. But once I went into it, the surprise was I really liked it. And I really found myself reading absolutely against the grain. And let me give you, if you don't mind, I'll give you an example. How many of you have seen one of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, one in the Indiana Jones film? Okay, everyone in the audience. Let's think about Indiana Jones. This is supposed to be the great American hero, right? You know, the guy who represents American culture. It's totally not true. He is a bumbler. He always, first of all, he never gets what he sets out to try to get. If you think about the films, the villains always defeat themselves. And he's wrong about everything in the film. He makes wrong decision after wrong decision after wrong decision, and never ends up with what he started out to capture. So I thought to myself, wow, if that's really true, where's the other stuff like that in Spielberg? And I think what happens is that critics make the mistake my freshman students would make. They associate the character with the director. Spielberg's not Indiana Jones. And his films offer critiques of American culture in a way that I think nobody talked about. So as that happened, I thought, oh shit, sorry. I thought, wow, I'm going to go against this raft of criticism, and that led me right to martinis. But after that was done, I thought, what an opportunity. So that's number one. And the second part of your question is, why dip into this stream twice? He's made 11 movies since 2006. Are they great movies? I don't think so. I think among them, Lincoln is the best movie. And so he keeps making interesting films. And I think the other appeal is he's my age, and he's Jewish. I mean, really, I think that, and we could talk about that aspect of his culture and his filmmaking. So he appealed to me on those levels, I think, in a way other filmmakers didn't. I mean, I've written on Clint Eastwood, as you know, and I like Clint Eastwood film, but it's just, I don't feel connected to them in the same way, I think.
Well, you bring up some interesting points, especially about Indiana Jones, and I think that's why Scorsese would define Spielberg as a smuggler. He's smuggling ideas in this wonderful, entertaining package that may not be the sort of the iconography that people latch onto, but it has that message about America and Americana as part of its underbelly.
Yeah, I think he is quintessentially an American filmmaker. He is quintessentially a genre filmmaker. And that's how, for those of you that I gave books to who haven't read it yet, We'll find out. That, look, genre work is tricky, right? To do genre well, you have to find a balance. You have to give enough of the genre conventions so that people recognize it and feel comfortable with the genre, and simultaneously you have to add enough new and unique so people aren't bored. And I think that's one of the tricks that Spielberg pulls off that the Spielberg-like directors, Michael Bay, can't do. And I think the second thing that happens that Spielberg does so well is you actually care about his characters. You know, and that's hard to do in many ways. So he manages to walk this kind of dangerous genre past, and he I guess I was just thinking what genre he hasn't done. Western. You know, that's about it. Indiana Jones is close. The last one is pretty close to a Western without the iconography. Yeah, so that's why too.
But it's also difficult to go back and do more of those as Spielberg when you've invented some of those tropes that are now being used within the genre.
Yes, yeah. I think that's absolutely true. He is doing, the fourth Indiana Jones is like the third Godfather. We don't talk about them. You know, we just don't do it. But he is doing another Indiana Jones, and I mentioned
as producer.
He's producing. He's not directing it. He is doing a film about his childhood. It's coming out in the spring. So I don't know if, you know, I said he's not doing adolescent fantasies anymore. Maybe it's too bad. But, you know, like I try to say, he's always alternating. He's always doing the prestige film. And by the way, speaking of Scorsese, he gave Scorsese Schindler's List. Could have been a film said directed by Martin Scorsese. He took it back. After he gave it to him, he gave him the remake of
Cape Fear.
Cape Fear, thank you. And so he's always doing the crowd pleaser and the prestige picture. But what's ironic in these 10 pictures that he's done since 2006, the prestige pictures have made more money. Except for the Indiana Jones film, which, you know, just everyone's going to go see. But in relation to the other film, Ready Player One, all that, the smart films, Minority Report, AI, stuff like that, made more money. And I don't know what this proves because the whole industry's going this way. All of these films, except Indiana Jones, have made more money internationally than domestically, where the whole movie industry is shifting to Asia, and it's very interesting to see where it's going to go now post-COVID and how Spielberg's going to do that.
I think within the book you do a great job at tying the interest of Spielberg in both these prestige projects and the genre stuff that he does. And it starts out on page 1 with the preface,
Yeah.
which is entitled by a quote from Spielberg, "Fear is my fuel." You talk about that?
Yeah, you would think Spielberg would be comfortable now, right? I mean, he's most successful. He's made billions of dollars. And his film is, you know, his place is assured one way or the other. And he says he finds projects that scare him. Because he says his greatest, and this is so interesting as an artist, and I know we have photographers and painters and other people who do arts out there. He says, my greatest problem is complacency. And he said, when I get fearful, then I make the best movies. And he does say that. And I mean, what chutzpah. When I heard he was doing West Side Story, I'm sure most of you must have, and I love West Side Story. You know, after a few martinis, I could sing the lyrics. But I thought to myself, why the hell make West Side Story of all things to make? But when you look at it, fits perfectly with Spielberg's fixations of particularly broken families, non-biological families being established to fight against an external hostile force. Think Jaws, those three guys. It fits perfectly in what he's doing, what he's interested in.
I think it's a wonderful double entendre as well, in that most of his films are built on some sort of fear that the characters are going through, whether it's
A threat.
a natural fear, a fear of conflict, a fear of the unknown.
No, you're absolutely right. And people who talk about him as the syrupy little adolescent filmmaker, I'm sure how many of you have seen E.T.? It's a scary movie, isn't it? If you're that kid, I mean, it's a scary movie. And Spielberg's child movies are like that. Empire Sun. How many films in Spielberg are there broken families or orphans? Just go through them. They're all over. And I think his fears, his uncomfortableness, his I mentioned he's Jewish, and he was brought up in very non-Jewish areas. So he suffered from anti-Semitic slurs when he was a kid. Where he tells a story about being in a class and a kid rolling a penny down the aisle and saying, "Get it, Jew boy." So I don't think he ever recovered from that. To some extent, however much acceptance he's getting, he's still a little Jewish kid from Arizona who's making his way around. I mean, that's simplistic. He's also the big boy at the same time. But I mean, and I've never met him, so I don't know what he feels, but that would be my 50-cent armchair analysis from his films.
But the family-friendly, broken family dynamic is also, present in Disney films, which have been, around for 35 years before he was making his own films. So can you talk a little bit about the influences that led him to becoming a filmmaker?
Yeah, so many influences on Spielberg. You have to understand that Spielberg was, in the 70s, Spielberg was working against the grain. If the 70s were a time of sex and drugs and rock and roll, Spielberg was the nerd in the corner who worked in the AV lab. I mean, that's who he was. And he was the famous story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps now mythical, was that he put on a suit. This is when he was still in college. He was rejected from USC, by the way. He put on a suit and went on the Universal tour, on the back lots of Universal, and he got off the trolley, found an empty office, and went to work there every day in the summer. And after a while, everyone knew him. He had no job. No one knew him. No one knew who he was. He just found this office and stayed there, and went around. And what he did was go to movie sets, and he watched people work. He watched, and then he had his own people who he loved, and you can see it in his film after film. David Lean. Just start there. Spielberg's understanding. David Lean did Lawrence of Arabia, these big, wide spectacles, right? And you can see that in Ryan, for example, the first 20 minutes in Ryan. So he really liked that. He liked the German expressionists, but he doesn't talk a lot about them. Yeah. He talks much more about American filmmakers and about, though David Lean's English, about his sort of visual consciousness from sitting and watching American cinema. Now, you have to understand then, the 70s is this time for these kids to take over Hollywood. Bonnie and Clyde, Easy Rider, and The Graduate occur, and Hollywood, the studio system crashes, and they start giving kids millions of dollars. So everyone wants to take out the camera in the streets, right? Everyone wants to go film life. Scorsese, Schrader, they're all out there. What does Spielberg do? He goes to Universal, he signs a contract, he goes into a studio. I mean, he is a traditional kind of guy. He isn't out there. I mean, he's the guy at the party not smoking pot. He really is. And it's interesting to see that he sort of inhaled all, I guess that's the image. He inhaled all of that, but it made him a filmmaker, but it didn't really change him as a person. Now, you have to understand, and it's really disgusting for those of us who are old, he made Jaws when he was 26, right? It doesn't get much bigger. So I think David Lean, and then I think his contemporaries, because he hung around with the guys, and they were all guys, by the way, and not so much European stuff. I think he did, ultimately, Polanski influenced him. I think Polanski influences Schindler, and as does German Expressionism, ironically.
Right.
Ironically,
Yeah.
influences Schindler.
Now, you structure your book not chronologically,
No.
but according to themes of the science fiction films, the adventure
Genre.
films, the war films. Yeah. Can you talk about your thought process in terms of getting to that point, and maybe a little bit about the particulars of each of those?
Yeah. I thought about how to structure it, and my first go-round was chronological. And Raylan will have to correct me. Was it someone who critiqued the books? Yeah. So the first editor, the first reader came back and said, you might think about him by genre instead of chronologically. It would make some sense. Because when I did it chronologically, I kept finding myself doing each chapter repetitive themes.
Yeah.
And I was bored. I fell asleep writing it. I was bored. And when the genre opened up, and that is American filmmaking, is genre filmmaking. Even independent filmmaking falls within genre to some extent. Once that opened up, it became clear to me, and I've talked a little bit already about the balance necessary to do genres, but I think it's part of his training in American cinema, in the history of American cinema. He saw where things fell. Now, what genres? That's interesting. I always said he hasn't made a Western, but he's gone to almost every other historical period, if you think about it. He's made a Civil War film, Lincoln. He's made contemporary at the time films like Jaws. He's gone back to World War II with the Raiders films. He's gone into the future with Minority Report and AI. He's done the Cold War with Bridge of Spies. So he really has gone through the periods. And so I think to see him, look, genre conventions can be shackles on a bad director. It can also give you a spine from which to work, and I don't think anybody who looks beyond the most superficial knowledge of Spielberg would think he doesn't change the genre. And you yourself, you put your finger on it. He recreates it for other people to imitate. At this point, I mean, I'm looking at the trailer for this Sandra Bullock film, Lost City?
Yeah.
It's Indiana Jones. I mean, it's what it is. So he has recreated it, and we certainly could spend a lot of time talking about what Jaws did to Americans. Jaws created the blockbuster. There was no summer blockbuster before Jaws. And yet Jaws, he said, moving off in an ADD tangent, Jaws is a brilliant film. My students still jump out of their seat when that damn shark comes out of the water, right? But think about Jaws for a moment. Think about what's going on. Think about you've all seen it, yeah. Think about the three guys who are together and what they represent. Quint, the old traditions, the harpoon. Richard Dreyfuss' character, new electronics, all this stuff. And then what do we have? A sheriff. A sheriff. Do you remember who kills the shark in Jaws? The sheriff. What does he kill it with?
Gun.
The rifle and the canister that explodes. So it's Quint's gun and Hooper's explosive, and that's how the shark is killed. by a combination of the old individual traditionalist and the new scientific character. Now, do you believe me that they pay me for this stuff? For that? Go ahead.
So, did you want to talk a little bit about the war film or the sci-fi film?
Yeah, sure. Biographically, Spielberg's father was in World War II and told him many, many stories, and he was quite fascinated with World War II in general. Again, I should ask, how many of you know? Okay. Ryan's got a weird history. Ryan is seen as the great American patriot movie, right? The Great War. And the opening 20 minutes of Ryan are cinema defining. Cinema defining. And we could talk about how he did that. And I'll tell you just quickly, the cameraman had no script. They didn't know what was going on. And he only used equipment that the cameraman had used on the invasion of Omaha Beach. So those 20 minutes are shot, I mean, indelibly etched in our minds, I think, after you see that. Okay, well, let's think about the rest of the film. Want to call this a typical American film? Let me posit this for you. Every act of morality in that film ends up killing somebody. Everything that is good also kills people. Guy wants to save a baby, he's shot. Guy argued, if you remember the film, he lets the German officer go, right? That they want to kill. Who kills Captain? That German officer that they've let go kills the central character in the film, Captain Miller. So once you see that, and then there's the whole idea of Mellish and how he gets killed, and the guy that's a coward who won't bring the ammunition, so his buddies get shot in the attack on Ravel. So once you start seeing that, you think, well, wait a minute. Now, what is this film about? Well, what is this film about? It's about 8 guys going to save one guy, and 4 of them, I think, or 5 maybe, die trying. Oh, is that worth it? That's a real question, right? That's a moral question. Does the saving of the one account for the destruction of the many? It's the reverse of the typical philosophical position. So Ryan, all of a sudden, the film becomes a way to think about war rather than a celebration of war. Now, I will tell you personally, I don't think it's possible to make an anti-war film. And I think the reason for that is because somewhere in that film, as in Ryan, you're going to show heroic action, right? So that somewhere in the film, combat's much more interesting than philosophical peace. So I think Spielberg saw that. And I don't think you can make a World War II film the same way you did pre-Vietnam, post-Vietnam. I mean, once you get to Vietnam in there, you got to rethink all of the tropes. Tropes are conventions on film. Sci-fi. Well, you got to combine sci-fi and fantasy because he does both. Now, what's the difference between science fiction and fantasy? You asked. Science fiction asks, what if? Science fiction is based in reality. It just takes it further, right? What if aliens landed? What if there was a little brown guy in the garage who likes Reese's Pieces? What if we could stop a crime before it happens? That's science fiction. Fantasy doesn't have reality at all. It creates its own reality, and so that's the BFG, or what am I blocking on? The
Hook.
Well, Hook's a good example. Sure, Hook. The other one with the kid whose hair is locked onto his head. What is it? You know what? Yeah, no, we didn't do. Boo! You don't go to the next round, Bob. Yeah, I'll come up with it. In any case, fantasy films, right? Fantasy films create their own world, and once you enter that world, the only restriction you have is that the rules of that world have to be followed. So like Lord of the Rings, you know, that's fantasy. Science fiction is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. E.T. somewhere in there, but still takes place in reality. So, but you have to now say this. Every science fiction and well, let me go back and say this about Ryan. So I want to say this about films about the past and films about the future. Films about the past, films about the future are all films made in the present. Right? So every film is about the present because you're trapped by technology, you're trapped by where society is at that moment, right? Where the culture is at that moment. And so you're really always talking about the future. I'll give you an example. Every film where humans meet aliens is really about race in the present. The alien is the dark other, the other. How do we confront the other? So that films about the future and films about the past are all about the present, because you're trapped in the present even if you're thinking about the future or the past. You're defined by present thought. So Spielberg, we should say one other thing about Spielberg's film. Before Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I'm thinking of films, you know this better than I, films of the 50s, science fiction films, aliens, they were all nasty, right? Mm-hmm. They were all frightening aliens. You know, now we're in the 50s, everybody's scared of McCarthy, and we're scared of the other, and we're scared of the different. Close Encounter comes along, and he totally shifts the paradigm. The aliens are good. The aliens are smarter than we are. And now we get to E.T., where not only are the aliens smarter and good, they're cuddly. Right? They're cuddly, and all they want to do, and this is a Spielberg thematic that runs through and through and through the film. All that he wants to do is go home. And home for Spielberg, because he comes from a broken home, because his first marriage broke up, which is the last thing he wanted to do. Home for Spielberg is a very complicated and yet desired place. What is home? What does home represent in Spielberg's films? And you're going to see characters again and again and again try to go home, whatever home represents. Do we want to let...
We've got some time.
Okay, go ahead.
If you want to hear more about Close Encounters and watch the film in context, Lester will be introducing it on May 13th at the Dryden Theater.
I hope you all come.
DCP at the. So
I didn't know I was doing that, but
yeah,
I will
talked about that.
I forget things.
I just assume things. So before we get to questions, I want to compliment you on your publicity campaign. The fact that you started writing this book with the idea that West Side Story was going to be coming out, which is a new genre for him, and that you would be launching as it's going through awards season and having your book launch the day before the Oscar ceremony. It was brilliant planning from years out. Why don't we talk a little bit about this newest film, West Side Story?
Okay, we have to say
it's not in the book. We're only going to have to get it here. No, it's not in the book.
I refer to it. I could have written about it without seeing it, and indeed it played out. How many of you have seen West Side Story? Owen Shapiro should be, not exonerated for his refusal to see it. So, how many of you have seen Robert Wise's West Side Story, the original movie? Oh, more yeah. People. Now, I bet you some of you didn't see it because you thought, why the hell should we see West Side Story again, right? And I thought that too. When my wife and I went, I went with great apprehension. I've already said, why that? I mean, do a bad musical. Do Brigadoon. I mean, do do something. Huh?
Hey, take it easy on Brigadoon.
Do you love Brigadoon?
I do.
I love Brigadoon.
Yeah.
Oh, I often sing to my wife Brigadoon songs, and she leaves the room.
I almost married a girl named Bonnie Jean.
Oh,
just for that.
Oh no! Did you?
No, that doesn't lie.
No. Okay. That's great. I love Brigadoon too. Just for the record. So he takes on fear is fuel. He takes on what would be the most fearful kind of project, right? West Side Story. I mean, now I must say again, I know West Side Story. You know, I know the lyrics to those songs. It actually happened to be a very pivotal moment in my adolescence to have seen West Side Story. And later in life, when Owen and I were at Syracuse, we brought Robert Wise there, and we got the director of West Side Story. So I was very, very familiar, very, very affectionate about it, and I thought, oh God, I just have to go because I'm the Spielberg guy, you know? We loved it. We absolutely loved it. We knew the story backwards and forwards, Ray Ellen and I, and we cried at the end of it. I mean, I'll give you an example. You and I talked a little bit about this before, how you can have a directorial comment that's subtle to some extent that you wouldn't think about. So you all know that I've seen it, the Jet song, right? Oh, I'm so tempted to sing it, but I won't. Okay, first of all, the story is set. Why are these kids pissed off? Why are they angry? Well, you never know that in the original. Here they're angry because they're demolishing their neighborhoods. And what are they building? What are they building to replace it? Lincoln Center. A home for rich people who love art. Okay, so we're doing the Jet song. And, you know, if you remember the original, they do it through the streets. Right, they do it through the streets. Here, they do it among the rubble from their neighborhood. And he ends up singing, when you're a jet all the way, on the top of a pile of rubble. I mean, I'm sitting there going, okay, Stephen, I'm in. You know, I'm in. And he does all the things you love. He does a version of America, which is my favorite song, in there, in the streets, dancing between cars, you know, in the middle. It just gets the camera down there. It is brilliant. Rita Moreno singing There's a Place for Us, which he takes out of its context and sings at a different time. Visually, David Lean is here. Robert Wise is here. We should say Robert Wise
German
is here.
expression.
Yes. And so the film works for me. And as I say, I enter with great trepidation, and yet, you've seen it too. You like it too. Well, you didn't like it as much as I liked it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you don't like Spielberg as much as I like Spielberg. It's true. That's true. So just the last thing to say, all the tropes from one of the most amazing things about Spielberg is all of the themes and all of the tropes are in the first film. And if you've never seen Duel, which is a television film, you should see it. All the tropes are there, and all the tropes are in West Side Story. And one of the things you can say about a great writer or a great filmmaker or a great artist is they revisit the same themes, their same obsessions, but they build on it in different ways, and they have a mature response as they grow older. Those themes are embedded, but still being worked on, and they're there in West Side Story, and they're there in Duel, and they're there in Jaws, and they're there in Close Encounters. What's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade about? It's not about finding an object, it's about reuniting with your father. You know, you don't need psychoanalysis to figure that one out. And it's right there again and again.
50 years, so 71 to 21.
Unbelievable, yeah. Huh? Unbelievable career. Who else has that career? Maybe Scorsese.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we don't have questions, I've got other stuff to ask you about somebody else.
Okay.
But let's. Are there any questions from the audience?
Or comments?
Right in front.
Besides Duel,
who's talking, Rick?
Can I hold this down just?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Besides Duel, I know that was a television. Was Band of Brothers an homage, because that was a series on television, was that an homage to his father?
Yes.
Because he was slightly obsessive with World War II.
More than slightly.
Yeah.
More than slightly. He's obsessed because it's the good war. You know, you're not going to have an argument about why we should be there. You're not going to not have no-fly zones, you know, and have an ethical argument about that. So he likes that, and yes, it is a homage to his father. And you know, Rick, you bring up an interesting side point. I've talked very glowingly about Spielberg. There's lots of stuff. I mean, there are very few mature women characters in Spielberg. He is a guy filmmaker, as is Eastwood. There's some, like in Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, Color Purple, you can think about it, has central characters. Very few. And yes, it's his father. I don't know if you know what happened. I'll just give you a very brief biographical moment. Spielberg's family broke up, and his father was blamed. He didn't speak to his father for over a decade. Wow. And then his mother, his beloved mother, told him that it was she who had the affair and broke up the family. Oh. And it totally reversed his thinking about family and also reunited him with his father, and is a homage to his father. I think that's true, Rick.
Just a side note, Valentina, when they called Rita Moreno, she said, I don't do cameos. They go, no, this isn't a cameo. We want you to be, you know, Doc's widow.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just, there's a strong woman character.
Yeah. Well, there are some, and he's trying, and if I know that critique, he knows that critique. Right. Yeah.
Another one here?
Repeat the question after.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I will. Yeah,
I actually have two questions. May I get two?
Sure.
Okay. When I look back at Jaws as a mature person, as opposed to when it first came out, and it was thrilling and scary and all those things, the two moments that I really focus on is Quinn's soliloquy.
Yep.
And then the real close-up of Dreyfus when he is witnessing for the first time the detritus, the destruction, and the sweat is pouring off his face, and just the intense close-up and the stillness of that. And I'm just wondering if you think that those sorts of moments, which kind of take their tradition from theater, I think, just transform the genre in that way, and that at different times in our lives we can appreciate the film for different things, which really speaks to its endurance. And then my second question.
That was just the first question?
That's just the first one.
You can answer that, and then I'll ask my second.
So I'm repeating the question for our audience online.
Oh, good luck.
Talking about Jaws.
Yeah.
And there are two particular moments that stand out: Quint's soliloquy and the close-up on Dreyfus's face. And if those particular moments, if it's a moment that redefines genre, or if it's a particular
I didn't quite catch the Dreyfus moment. Which one did you talk?
He said it's in like a lab setting, and he's seeing the contents of the shark.
Oh yeah, when they cut the shark that isn't the shark.
And his sweat is just pouring off him.
Yeah, that wouldn't be the scene I would think, but you do put your finger on the famous scene, which is and it's all true, what Quinn says, and there's a large argument about who wrote it and all that business, and yeah, that is a scene that transforms the genre, because suddenly you understand why there's an obsession with this fish. And what does this fish represent? Well, you know, if you're a literary person, you're Moby Dicking right away. But it represents any threat to the community. And that's what Spielberg is all about. How do we defend the community? And the person who ends up defending the community is the regular, normal guy. I should say something about Jaws. Maybe some of you know this. First of all, the shark was named after his lawyer. And they called the shark that. But the shark never worked. Now, this is before computer-generated images. So they didn't know what the hell to do. They didn't know what to do about the shark. And Spielberg, who had seen The Thing, said, well, we won't show the shark. Let's just not show the shark. And of course, the shark doesn't show up for 40 minutes, and all you hear is John Williams' theme, which is now ubiquitous, right? And by the way, Spielberg rejected that theme the first time he heard it. He said, it's too simple. And John Williams says, no, 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 this is it. And so you don't see the shark, and by the time you see the shark, you're bought into the picture. You've bought into it. So when, you know, you chum this shit. Blah! You know, I mean, there's lovely stuff. In the scene previous to one you're talking about, Allison, Quint and the Dreyfus character are comparing scars. This to this, and suddenly the sheriff lifts up his shirt because he had his appendix out. You know, and you know, just stuff like that. The other thing we might talk about if we had a lot of time is how Spielberg's film defined masculinity. And you know, it's very, and I know I've already said his women characters are not great, and we talk a lot about the male gaze and what it is, but Spielberg's male characters are always confused. They don't know what to be, what's their role as a father, a lover, a husband. They're just very, take Close Encounters. Take the Dreyfus character in Close Encounters. He doesn't know what the hell's going on, you know, and almost all of Spielberg's men, even when they're trying to be manly like Tom Cruise, they're phonies. They're just putting up a front because that's how they think men should behave. You know, unlike all of the men in here.
Question 1B.
Oh, what was that?
Was about how.
No, I haven't had my second.
Well, no, but you did ask about
Dreyfus?
how perceptions of films change as we age and we go through different experiences.
Yeah, I talk about that, and it's true. And the example I give, very famous scene, some of you are old enough to remember, with Jack Nicholson when he is ordering a chicken, he wants some bread. I think five easy pieces, and he's, you know, swipes it off. Most of you know what I'm talking about who are over 20? Yes. Okay. Well, I remember standing up in the audience with everyone else going, yes! You know, that was a moment. Well, now I look at that and I think, what the hell are you doing? You know, this poor waitress has now worked a 15-hour shift. You're giving her grief. You know, she's not her rules. Just shut up or talk to the manager or do that. So I think films, you know, if in my genre book I make a circle about how, and here's the work, and over here is the artist, and over here is the audience, but around it all is culture. Because it affects, so the text always remains frozen. But not for us, because we change and we see things differently. I mean, look, Shakespeare didn't know Freud when he wrote Hamlet. Right? Well, we can't read Hamlet without knowing Freud now. The text has changed radically, and as does the age. And the Me Too movement and the women's liberation movement in particular has just shifted what's called the male. When they talk about the male gaze, what they're saying essentially is that it's a man looking through a camera. So a man looking through a camera at a beautiful woman might concentrate on different parts of her body than a woman looking through the character would concentrate on, looking through the camera would concentrate on. That's, you know, a short and dirty version of the male gaze. So I think while the text remains in amber, to use a Spielberg reference, our response to, and that's any art, that's picture, photography, literature, certainly you know, I can't read On the Road. I'm sorry, Jack Kerouac. It seems like the ravings of an 18-year-old to me. You know, and yeah, it's a great piece of literature, right? But, you know, I came to it too late in life.
Question 2?
Yeah, so I recently saw this documentary on Andy Warhol, and they're interviewing some of his contemporaries, but the next generation as well. And Glenn Ligon talks about how we define an artist and the artist's there's so much debate about Warhol during his lifetime, of course, and one of the critiques was that, you know, he keeps shifting around and changing his entire aesthetic, his approach, and Ligon says, well, we want our artists to be crystallized, fully formed, but I see being an artist as we're always making ourselves, finding ourselves. That is our process. And I was thinking about that in
He does it. I think
why he's still making films. He's 76. They change. Some are better. Some are worse.
Yeah.
Isn't it this self-realization process?
She's asking about Spielberg's overall career and and yeah, and I think I said this to some extent, that it's the same themes changed all the time, but they're there. They're just there. And you know, I think that great artists do that. I mean, I think, you know, my nomination for the great American writer is Mark Twain. And I think he does that. If you look at Huck Finn and you look at the other stuff, you know, or Mary Shelley, you know, or any of the great contemporary writers, male, woman, whatever. I think a lot of other people have their hands up too.
Are we
Nick,
okay to keep going? Yeah.
Nick,
All right.
did you have your hand up, Nick?
Yeah.
Has Spielberg read your book, and what does he think about it?
Has Spielberg read your
Yeah,
book?
you know, there's a backstory here. The first backstory is when I wrote the Bonnie and Clyde book, I got to spend a lot of time with Arthur Penn and David Newman, the director and the screenwriter. And when I was writing that book, over my shoulder was always, will they like me? Will I be invited back to Arthur's house in the Berkshires if I write this book? So I decided at that point I would never know someone who I was writing about. But Spielberg's sister was coming to Rochester. And I got her email. Wasn't hard. She was doing the Jewish book thing. I wrote her. I said, I've written this book about your brother, and I'd like to give it to you. If you would give it to him, I'd appreciate that. Well, kindly she wrote back. And she said, look, in our family, we've just decided we can't give anything to Stephen. Everywhere I'd go, I'd come home with 100 scripts. You know, so I wrote her back and I said, well, thank you. I appreciate your note and looking forward to seeing you in Syracuse. And about a week later, she wrote back and she said, of course, nothing will stop me from giving you the name and address of Stephen's assistant. Good. I wrap up the book, I write, I hope this book gives you somewhere near the pleasure your films have given me and less. Send it off. And that was it. I said to Raylan, that's it. You know, that's fine with me. Well, lo and behold, a couple weeks later, I get a phone call from Spielberg's assistant. And she says, I just want you to know the book arrived and we've all read parts of it and we really love it and thank you. And she's very kind. So I said, well, you know, I appreciate that, but I have to ask if he read it. And so she said, she was very funny, she said, well, you know, he never reads things about himself. I said, oh, okay. She says, but I can tell you he loved the Jaws chapter. I said, done, right? Doesn't get any better than that. Doesn't get any better.
And do we have any questions from online?
We don't.
Okay. Well, does anybody else have questions in the audience then?
One more.
Yes, sir.
Tintin. Feels like an unfinished job there.
Tintin, The Adventures of
Oh,
Tintin.
that's the movie I was trying to come up with before.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't.
The hair locked into place now.
Yeah,
okay.
the guy with the hair. Yeah, he's talking about The Adventures of Tintin. My guess is most of you haven't seen it, right?
It's a great movie. It's a lot of fun.
Is it?
Yes.
I found it disturbing. Who is this kid? Why does his hair not move? Does he really work? We don't see anything that he's writing. He's riding around. It was Spielberg's immersion into mocap, you know, which is this kind of, they're in a green screen room, essentially, and their whole body has these things on it that the computer picks up, and it's quite complicated. Is it an unfinished movie? My thought would be I'm happy not to have him finish it. So we'll just differ on that one. I didn't.
The wonderful thing about the mocap is that it actually brings cinematic camera movement
Yes,
into
it
the
does.
animated world,
Yeah.
as opposed to just being two-dimensional.
And when he gets to Ready Player One, the whole thing is that basically, and he's able to capture facial expressions, which he doesn't capture all that much in Tintin. I think he does in the BFG too. If any of you have seen that as well.
Yes, sir.
Rick, let's go.
Easy.
Rick, let's go to someone first
Yeah, no,
here.
I
I know you well enough to insult you. Yes,
You do know me well.
yes, I know.
So, West Side Story. My wife and I sat there, and both of us had periods of being bored. Could he have ended it a little tighter, so it moved a bit better?
West Side Story, according to the question, it's too long. There's boring parts. We cut it down.
Did you think there were boring parts in the original?
You know, I'm old, not as old as you. I do not remember.
Wait, I need to repeat that for the people at home. He's old, but not as old as you.
Well, yeah, I get it. I don't know. I guess this, that's just taste by this point. I didn't find it boring. I don't think Ray Allen found it boring when we watched. Maybe. I mean, I think some of his movies are too long. A lot of people. I really recommend Empire of the Sun. I know a lot of people haven't seen it, but a lot of people find that boring as well. I'm just trying to think. And I don't know I just don't know the answer to this. If it was much longer than the original.
I don't think so.
I don't
Not the
think
original film. They were both over 2 hours.
They're both over 2 hours. I sat through, and I think the people are here who sat with me through almost 3 hours of the Batman, and I kept saying, "Cut!" Time to go.
You must be a riot to go to films with.
I am. I said it. My movie buddies are all here, all four of them. I don't talk during movies. That's just personal.
Do you have any idea how Spielberg gets his new ideas for movies? How many does he reject, or how does he get into it?
The sources for the films, the ideas that he had, there are some that he gets from other sources, books and everything, but is there a process that he goes through to select? And how many does he throw away?
Yeah. By the way, when I was going through the war films, I forgot War Horse, World War I. So he does all of them. Civil War up. He doesn't do He doesn't do the Revolutionary War. Might be next as a musical.
1776.
1776. Yeah, Spielberg. His sources are varied. Over the years, he has worked with great writers. Alice Walker comes to mind immediately. A lot of it is an idea from childhood, as is Close Encounters, as is E.T. I don't think Jaws. Well, Jaws, Peter Benchley. So I think, Udo, that he does a variety of sources, but lately he's been working with the Angels in America.
Tony Kushner.
Yeah, Kushner, and that's been an interesting thing. Kushner has said that Spielberg has taught him dialogue, and Spielberg said Kushner taught him dialogue, and Spielberg said that he taught Kushner movement. I mean, Angels in America's got pretty good dialogue. Ironically, Angels in America mentions Spielberg. Something comes down from the roof and the character goes very Spielbergian, before he started to work. And Munich is another film I would recommend to you, a very underrated, very, very interesting film. We should talk just a minute about his Jewish side. I think and of course you paint with a very broad brush when you start doing this stuff about, you know, what is Jewish sort of thing. But one of the things you can say with pretty much assurance is a focus on the outsider. And I think that that's in almost all of Spielberg's films. But interestingly enough, in regard to his own Jewish heritage, the two films that sort of fit as strange bookends are Schindler and then Munich. I don't know if you know, Munich deals with the terrorist killing during the Munich Olympics, which was filmed and shot around the world. It's the first time a terrorist act actually in progress was filmed. And, you know, Jews dying in Germany again, especially Israeli Jews, which are differentiated from European and American, that got to Spielberg, and of course Israel sent out a squad to kill those guys, which is now kind of common thing to do, right? It wasn't then, and it's a very interesting take. Both of those films are interesting takes on Jewish identity, I think, and response to the Holocaust and response to what some feel are excesses in Israel. And of course he was loved by Schindler's List, and he was reviled in Israel for making Munich. So it's an interesting pairing, I think.
I think we have time for
One more. Okay. Well, Rick, you've been.
Rick, you've been
I'm starting
patient.
to know people by name.
Oh, is there someone
Is there
here?
someone
We're
here?
going to put
Oh.
you, Rick, we're going to,
No.
okay.
You're in the.
Sorry.
You're cutting room floor.
I think Chris has a question. Chris has a question.
Yeah, I'm going to throw you a hypothetical. Spielberg was on fire in the 70s and the 80s, right? He had a string of big hits. I think at one point in time I actually saw, like in the 90s, he went back and looked at the biggest grossing films on an inflation basis. His were like 5 of the top 10 or something. And that gave him permission, I mean, it was Spielberg, that gave him permission to do all kinds of different things. You said you started the book in chronological order first time around and then changed it. Does Spielberg become Spielberg if his movies were done in a different sequence and therefore he didn't have the brand and the cachet by the time he got into some of those other projects?
This is in the fantasy realm
That's right.
of Spielberg.
I'd go there.
Spielberg study. If Spielberg made the films in a different order, would he still have been Spielberg?
That's a great question. And you can see I'm taking a dramatic pause.
How Spielberg-esque.
Yeah. Thank you. It's just hard to envision it. To narrow your question down, I think, would Spielberg have been Spielberg if he didn't make Jaws? I mean, that's the fundamental question. And he had done films before Jaws, you know, including a really interesting film with Goldie Hawn, a chase film, and
Sugarland Express.
yeah, right. And if he didn't make Jaws, I think Spielberg would have gone in a very different direction. I think he would have been, he always would have been a studio maker, but he wouldn't have had, and you put your finger right on it, Chris, he wouldn't have had the cachet and he wouldn't have had the reputation. Now remember, he follows Jaws, pardon me, Close Encounters in E.T., and then he segues essentially into Raiders, you know, so he, and I think some of the things the critic miss is that Spielberg can make any film he wants. Any film he wants. Nobody but Spielberg could have made Color Purple. Nobody, certainly than Spielberg, could have made Schindler in black and white for 3 hours with a European cast, no stars. Certainly no one would have wanted to make West Side Story. But I guess what I'm saying is that Spielberg, popcorn movies aside that give him the cachet and the money, he's tackled some difficult stuff. You know, he could have made Indiana Jones 27. I mean, he could have kept making it. He could go make a Marvel film, and maybe that's going to be in his future with a suit. He hasn't chosen to make a superhero film. But I'll tell you, you look at those superhero films and they're very Spielbergian. Very, very Spielbergian in terms of their structure and format. So I think the answer to your question, if he hadn't made Jaws, I think he would have been a very competent maker of little films. You know, I think he would have been able to do that if he wanted to do it. But you know, making Jaws just changed everything. I mean, again, stop and think. There was no blockbuster. First film to make $100 million. I mean, on and on and on. What that film did. First film to do basically open in multiple theaters. One of the first films to be preceded by television advertising. So Jaws changes the landscape.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here with us this afternoon. I want to thank everybody online, and writers and books, and Dan for hosting us. Most of all, thank you, Les, for taking the time to talk about our book.